Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Please put up the screen, the welcome screen for a moment. So, welcome to the webinar, Avoiding the Unintended Consequences of Fluorinated Gas Emissions from Residential Heat Pumps, presented by the 350 Mass Science Working Group and the Statewide Legislative Team. So my name is Philip Vergraaf. I'm a member of 350 Mass the Newton Node and the chair of the 350 Mass Science Working Group. To battle the climate emergency that we're all interested in and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, one of the main greenhouse gas emission sources is caused by heating uninsulated houses. Greenhouse gas emissions both by carbon dioxide and by methane of leaking natural gas. So insulating houses and buildings and then installing heat pumps in Massachusetts is a major campaign issue for 350 Mass, but you need to be aware of possible unintended consequences and side effects. So we are the Science Working Group, established about 1 year ago, and the Statewide Legislative Team organized this webinar. We have two speakers tonight. Mark Dyan will introduce the 350 Mass statewide campaign on retrofitting and electrifying heating, cooling, and cooking. Mark is a member of the Newton Node of 350, a co-chair of 350 Mass statewide legislative team, and a retired designer and implementer of utility-funded energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. He will speak for about 10-15 minutes, and then there will be a short Q&A. The next main speaker for tonight will be Jonathan Krones, Dr. Jonathan Krones, Assistant Professor of Practice in Engineering at Boston College. Outside the university, he has experience working and consulting in energy, sustainability, and climate policy at local, state, and federal levels. He authored the Non-Energy Sector Report, a technical report of the Massachusetts 250 Decarbonization Roadmap Study, published in December 2020. He will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how he feels tonight and how receptive you are. Again, followed by Q&A and discussion. So a few housekeeping rules. During the presentations, you can put your questions in the chat box, please. After each of the presentations, I will read the chat, the question, and possibly ask to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. During the discussion, you can also type stack in the chat box, and I will give you the floor for question or comments. And with that, it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Mark Dyan.
Thank you very much, Philip. So what brings us here tonight is sort of a technical aspect of a political and policy campaign that 350 has devoted itself to for this year. The goal of the campaign is to move the state towards a commitment to and a practice of retrofitting approximately 1 million homes by 2030, retrofitting them to the point where they are more energy efficient and where their heating system, hot water system, and cooking system are replaced by whatever they have, replaced by non-emitting sources of heat and cooling. Now, the goal of 1 million homes represents approximately a third of the dwelling units in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, of which right now about 17% of the homes in Massachusetts are already heated with electricity, leaving 83% heated by fossil fuel, mostly gas, 50% gas, heating oil, and propane. Those heating systems and those hot water systems and the cooking systems that go with them produce something like a quarter, and the similar systems in commercial and industrial buildings produce about 27-28% of the emissions that are produced in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So that a plan to implement the Next Generation Roadmap bill that was signed this year that puts us on a path towards zero emissions by 2050 involves changing the heating systems, the hot water systems, and the cooking systems of the buildings of Massachusetts. That's how we got to the project and the goal of doing approximately a third of the buildings in the first third of the 30-year period. Seems logical, and apparently occurred at about the same time that we came up with a number to Governor Baker, who came out with approximately the same number in the state plan. The bill that we have filed is Building Justice with Jobs. It is now in the Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy, along with a number of other bills that promote retrofitting of residential buildings in the Commonwealth. So if we're going to carry out the plan that is in the governor's plan and is proposed in our legislation, the plan involves putting heat pumps, either ground source heat pumps or air source heat pumps, in 1 million homes over a short period of time, over what is now 9 years, and shrinking every day. So one of the questions there is, what could go wrong in that plan? There are some difficult sort of engineering and operational questions that come with a project of this size. Is there a workforce capable of doing it? Are there quality assurance systems capable of seeing whether the installations are done properly? Can you gear up the energy efficiency programs of Mass Save and the low-income weatherization network to the point where they can handle this volume? These are reasonable questions, but it's not that difficult to figure out ramp-up plans that can deal with each of these problems. But what brings us here tonight are one of the two problems that are inherent in the plan that cannot be overcome by good organizational design. The one that we're not going to deal with tonight is the question of, would this transformation of the heating and hot water systems in the Commonwealth overload the electrical system on peak? Because what we're doing is adding, assuming the program goes forward, we're adding hundreds of thousands of heat pumps, both for heating building and for heating hot water, to the system every year. And the heating systems, at least, are going to peak their demand on whatever demand they put on the electrical system will peak on the coldest day of the year, coldest night of the year, actually. And so that's a serious concern, and we'll probably have to work on another presentation to cover that one. The other concern that brings us here tonight is that the heat pumps use refrigerants to operate. And I'm sure somebody's going to ask, how do heat pumps work? And we can answer that when it's asked. But all heat pumps use a refrigerant of one sort or another. And the ones that are in common use in the United States are complex chemicals, Hfcs, that when released in the atmosphere have damaging impacts on our greenhouse gases on their own. So that the question for tonight is the potential of CFC releases that is inherent in the heat pump plan that we have a serious concern that we need to modify the plan to deal with, or is it a manageable concern that a well-designed plan can approach? And that is the subject for tonight's, the scientific part of tonight's effort. On the political side, as I said earlier, there actually is broad agreement on the goal of retrofitting approximately 1 million homes by 2030 as a piece of the plan to get to zero emissions by 2050. Implementing that goal will take solving these technical problems and reaching political consensus on the design of the program, the incentives to be instituted, and the relationship of several of the major players in the current system towards that. In particular, what role the utilities are going to play in implementing the program. Our proposal, Building Justice with Jobs, takes these political issues and says, for the most part, we are interested in an operational plan that will work, and we are agnostic on the administrative approach to it, except that we believe it's a public responsibility, and there has to be public oversight of this process. And I would say that we are concerned by the sort of vague oversight that Mass Save now has in its weatherization programs. The other political concern, non-technical concern, is that the people who will have the most difficulty taking advantage of these programs and moving into the new way of heating homes are the same people who suffer the most from concentrations of pollution in their neighborhoods, and are the same people who have the least control over their housing, since they're primarily tenants. That is, the residents of environmental justice communities and low-income individuals. Our legislation highlights the difficulty of reaching those populations and calls on the state to concentrate its marketing and incentive efforts on those areas, both for social justice reasons, for dealing with concentrations of pollution that characterize environmental justice communities, and to have the maximum impact on emissions, because emissions are highest in the oldest, leakiest, and least well-heated homes that people occupy. So that's the centerpiece of our legislation. It raises administrative issues that we're going to have to deal with, but I think tonight we want to concentrate on the technical side of things, which is, can we operate a program on this scale, putting this many heat pumps into people's homes with confidence that the savings that the heat pumps achieve, on their label, are actually going to be achieved, because we will be not be adding other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as things go along. So that's my comments for the moment. I would now turn the microphone over to Jonathan. Well, actually, no. The next, I believe, is there may be some questions. Yes.
So thank you, Mark. There are two questions in the chat. The first question, if some brands of heat pumps are better than others, I will forward to the next speaker. But the second question is interesting for now. Is there potential for solar, thermal, or passive solar to provide an alternative source of heat? Mark, maybe you can reflect for a moment on that.
I think, as I understand the current technology there, those solar thermal, so I'll take them as separate things. Solar thermal would be a supplement to some other heating system. Solar thermal active, as I understand it, cannot provide the heating level we need in a normally insulated house. Now, passive solar is a design of the home so that the home absorbs, the materials in the home absorb heat from the sun during the day and release it at night, or when, and you can sort of, that obviously has seasonal implications. In our experience so far, retrofitting passive solar into an existing structure is extremely difficult. You need to locate the glazing area of the house on the solar side and have some material that will absorb the heat. It is absorb the sunlight and turn it into heat and retain it overnight. It's difficult, as I say, it's difficult to put in a retrofit fashion, although I think that we should be technically open to such developments as they go forth. It's certainly, passive solar is a significant part of design of new construction, so that we don't need conventional heating systems or very large conventional heating systems.
So another question came on. Thank you, Mark. Another question came up from Lev Friedman. Do you imagine the Commonwealth giving financial help to homeowners, or are we on our own?
Yeah, I believe the program needs to have a system of financial assistance for homeowners to do this work. combination of incentives along the lines of the ones now offered by Mass Save for weatherization, and an expansion of a low interest loan or on-bill financing to pay for the projects. Otherwise, it will not happen at scale.
Then we have Kurt Newton. I live in a passive solar retrofit. Maybe you can speak yourself, Kurt.
I just wanted to offer that it is possible. I actually live in one, and I can absolutely vouch for the kind of complexity and what it takes to get it there. But it is possible. It is possible, and happy to talk with people offline if they want more detail.
Right. And
okay.
if I may say something, add something to that, Philip.
Yeah,
the way to approach this is not to think of one solution solving everything, but elements of solutions will be, in effect, custom designed for homes depending on their condition and depending on the willingness of the homeowner to go further than the program designs. What I think we need, what we're proposing, is a basic approach that improves the energy efficiency of the buildings, provides technical support for conversion of the heating and hot water system to, at the moment, heat pump-based systems, and the financing and quality assurance systems that would be needed to make those approaches available to essentially the entire population.
Okay. I think I forgot to say that this meeting is being recorded. So if you cannot accept that, you're free to leave at this moment or just be silent. Thank you very much, Mark. We will come back in the discussion. Of course, on the financial part, we have now a major infrastructure bill, which includes a lot of money that will come to the states for retrofitting and hopefully also for heat pumps. And now the floor is for Jonathan Krones. I already introduced you, Jonathan, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Philip and Mark and 350 Mass for having me here this evening. And thank you all for being here. I'm pleased to have the time to talk about a tricky part of decarbonization, which is home heating. The most appealing way to get homes off natural gas and oil heat is this technology called a heat pump, which is basically an air conditioner that can move heat into your house as well as out of it, depending on the season. Turns out, however, that heat pumps, air conditioners, and related technologies like refrigerators have an inherent climate risk lurking just inside. The refrigerants that they use are, in almost all cases, extremely powerful greenhouse gases, some even thousands of times more potent than CO2 per unit mass. There are alternatives to these high global warming potential refrigerants, but they're not very common in the marketplace yet, and they come with some of their own challenges. So, to butcher the proverb, are we stuck between the rock of natural gas and the hard place of fluorinated refrigerants? How can we move forward when our best alternative to a bad thing is itself bad in a slightly different way? Should we push for the deployment of heat pumps today, or wait until low GWP refrigerants are available on the market? In this presentation, I'm going to do my best to lay out these trade-offs with as much clarity as I can, and make the argument that the upsides of eliminating fossil fuel use for home heating as soon as possible largely outweigh the risks of F-gas emission from heat pumps. Moreover, there are well-established and proven practices around fluorinated gas management that should be adopted to mitigate or minimize the risk while new so-called natural refrigerants are brought onto the market. Much of the modeling work for this presentation came from my study of non-energy emissions in Massachusetts that I prepared for the 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap. I also rely on a number of other sources that I'll reference as the presentation unfolds. So to start, I'm going to offer a primer on how heat pumps work and why they're appealing alternatives to fossil fuel and even electric heating systems. Then we'll take a look at fluorinated gases themselves, what they are, how and why they're used, and some of the relevant national and global trends. Next, we'll examine the trade-offs associated with the use of heat pumps and discuss unintended consequences from aggressive adoption of today's technology. And finally, we'll discuss techniques for mitigating the risk of F-gas emissions from heat pumps and other applications. This shouldn't take more than a half an hour, so let's get into it. A heat pump is a generic term for a machine that moves heat from place to place. In nature, heat energy wants to move from places of hotter temperature to those of cooler temperature, just like this ball on the slope wants to roll from a higher elevation to a lower one. A heat pump pushes this metaphorical ball up the hill, moving heat from cold to hot. This takes some external energy in the form of electricity. You may not have realized it, but you have a heat pump, probably multiple, in your home right now. A refrigerator is a type of heat pump, continually taking heat from the cold air inside your fridge and freezer and dumping it into the comparatively warm environment of your kitchen. An air conditioner works very similarly, taking heat from inside your home and moving it outside into the even hotter summer air. When we talk about heat pumps specifically, we're usually referring to a device that sort of acts like an air conditioner in reverse, taking heat from the cold winter air and moving it inside your home, increasing the indoor air temperature. The way that heat pumps, including refrigerators and air conditioners, work is what's known as the vapor compression refrigeration cycle. Without getting into too much technical detail, I want you to think about the last time you sprayed an aerosol can. The best example of this is probably the canned air used to clean off a keyboard or something like that. Do you remember what happened to the can when you released the pressure of the gas inside? When the pressure decreases quickly, the can gets cold. The opposite is also true. When you increase the pressure of a gas, its temperature goes up. This is what's happening to the refrigerant inside your AC, fridge, or heat pump. It uses a few other principles of thermodynamics as well, but cycling this substance, this refrigerant, from low pressure to high pressure and back allows a heat pump to absorb heat in a cool or even cold environment and release it in a hot one. The fact that heat is being transferred and not created is why heat pumps are so much more efficient than conventional electric heating. We define efficiency as the amount of useful work we get out of a process divided by the energy we put into it. If you have two cars and one burns a gallon of gas to drive 30 miles and another burns a gallon of gas to drive 25 miles, the first is more efficient than the second. From this perspective, electric heating seems like a pretty good deal. Essentially, all of the electric energy that goes into the heater gets converted into heat as it passes through high resistance wires or ceramics. You put in 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, and you can effectively produce 1 kilowatt hour of heat. However, with heat pumps, we have to remember that the heat comes from somewhere else, and all that we're doing is putting in the energy necessary to run a compressor and some fans. Instead of efficiency, we consider the related concept, coefficient of performance, which tells us the ratio between the amount of useful heat moved by the heat pump and the amount of electricity consumed in the process. It turns out that the COP of heat pumps can be as high as 3.5 or 4, which means that you put in 1 kilowatt hour of electricity and get out 3.5 or 4 kilowatt hours of useful heat. Oftentimes, COP is down around 2, but that's still twice as efficient, in a way, as electric heating. The high efficiency of heat pumps is also bolstered by the use of what are known as ductless mini-split systems. Most commonly seen today with air conditioning, these technologies rely on the reality that our main goal with indoor heating and cooling is to make things more comfortable for the building occupants, heating and cooling the person rather than the space. The major benefit of mini splits, therefore, is the extreme zone control. You can just heat or cool the room you're in without also heating and cooling the rest of your home. The other benefit comes from the ductless part. even in central air conditioning systems with good zone control, you're still moving hot or cold air around the building through ducts, which lose heat and cold as they move through the house. In ductless mini splits, you move the refrigerant itself around, which can be done in a much smaller, much better insulated line. In order to connect a single outdoor unit, these systems use a technology sometimes called variable refrigerant flow, which I only include here for literacy purposes, as you may see this abbreviation thrown around by HVAC contractors. So I'm going to close this initial part of my presentation by talking about heat pumps in cold climates like ours. Conventional wisdom suggests that heat pumps are not recommended below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're in a climate with a lot of days below that temperature, the recommendation historically would have been to go with other heating options. Times have changed, as have technologies, and now there are heat pumps on the market that work reasonably well in colder climates, but outdoor temperature still does affect the coefficient of performance, among other things. The efficiency of a heat pump depends on the difference between indoor and outdoor temperatures. If the difference is small, then it takes less work to push the ball up the hill, to return to the model from before. If it's very cold outside, but we want to maintain a reasonable indoor temperature, then the difference in temperature will be quite large, and therefore a lot of energy will be required to drive the heat pump. We can take a look at this graph of theoretical maximum COP of a heat pump, where outdoor cold temperatures are on the horizontal axis, and indoor warm temperatures are represented by the three different curves. You can see that as outdoor temperature goes down, so does COP. Similarly, as indoor temperature goes up, for any given outdoor temperature, COP also decreases. Okay, of course, these are theoretical values, and the real COPs are significantly smaller, but still strictly above 1. To dispel a possible misconception, just because it's cold outside does not mean there's no heat in the air to gather. After all, your freezer gathers heat from the sub-zero air and moves it to the back of the appliance with little problem. It simply means that it takes more energy and more time to perform the heating task. One way that heat pumps have been adapted to cold climates is through the addition of a supplemental heater, which kicks on only when outdoor temperatures are below a certain threshold where the heat pump wouldn't operate very effectively. Conventionally, this is natural gas or an oil burner, but today it's much simpler to integrate a resistive heater into the heat pump. Another approach to cold weather heat pumps is the use of the ground as the source of heat rather than the air. If you go down just a few feet into the ground, temperatures stay pretty constant throughout the year, cooler than air in the summer and warmer than air in the winter. In both cases, the difference between the indoor and outdoor temperatures is decreased, increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of AC and heat pumps. Installation of these geothermal heat pumps can be quite expensive, however. So now let's move on to discuss refrigerants and fluorinated gases. As a transition from the previous section, the vapor compression refrigeration cycle requires a refrigerant with some particular properties, including low freezing and boiling points, good compressibility, good thermal characteristics, and favorable economics. The first substances to really satisfy all the necessary requirements are known as chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. If this term rings a bell, it's because these gases are ozone-depleting substances and are now banned under the Montreal Protocol. Their replacements largely came in the form of another fluorinated chemical, hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. These gases are, thankfully, not ozone-depleting and have many similar thermodynamic properties to CFCs. However, they are instead greenhouse gases, and some of the most powerful that we know of. So as an aside, organofluorine chemistry has been simultaneously miraculous and extraordinarily problematic. Fluorinated compounds show up everywhere in our modern lives: coatings, solvents, propellants, refrigerants, dielectrics, pharmaceuticals, toothpaste, while also being at the root of the ozone hole, major contributors to global warming. PFAS exposure is now known to contribute to endocrine disruption, and even fluorinated oxidizing agents were deemed by rocket scientists in the 1960s and 70s to be too powerful, the rocket fuel developer and author John Drury Clark quipped that the best protection against certain fluorinated compounds was a good pair of running shoes. And anyone who has worked in a chemistry lab knows that hydrofluoric acid is a terrifying compound that can dissolve your bones. So for what all that's worth. When we discuss the climate effects of fluorinated gases, or F-gases, we generally talk about four categories: hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, perfluorocarbons, PFCs, nitrogen trifluoride, NF3, and sulfur hexafluoride, SF6. HFCs are a huge category of different chemicals, but on average, at least weighted by current usage, they have an atmospheric lifetime when emitted of about 15 years and a 100-year global warming potential of 1,700. Although the most potent HFCs are nearly 13,000 times as powerful as CO2 per unit mass. PFCs, NF3, and SF6 are even more powerful than the average HFC, but are emitted at considerably smaller quantities than HFCs. I'm happy to talk about those gases in the Q&A if you want. In 2018, HFC emissions in the US totaled 191 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, less than 3% of the total 6.67 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalents emitted in the US that year. Of this quantity, 90% arose from the use of HFCs in refrigeration and air conditioning systems. The remaining 10% comes from aerosols, foams, solvents, and fire suppression systems. These emissions are mainly composed of just four compounds, which I had on the previous slide. I had the details on the previous slide: HFC 32, 125, 134A, and 143A. If those four compounds make your eyes cross, I don't know what to tell you. It gets way worse. But the emission of those gases are the result of system leakage. Chillers, air conditioning units, and heat pumps can lose some refrigerant when they're first manufactured and charged. They can leak gradually over their lifetime through compressors and other leaky components, as well as during servicing events or accidents. And finally, at end of life, this equipment can vent its remaining refrigerant charge to the atmosphere if not handled responsibly. Leakage rates from this equipment varies by model, installation and maintenance practice, and age, with some equipment not leaking at all and others much more prone to leaks and fugitive emissions. Globally, the demand for refrigerants is growing rapidly, driven by increasing population, affluence, which strengthens the expectation of air conditioning and refrigeration, and urbanization, which increases the need for indoor AC as well as refrigeration for food. The rise in global temperatures due to climate change exacerbates all other trends. One estimate in a recent joint report from the International Energy Agency and the UN Environment Program suggests that there are 3.6 billion cooling appliances in use in the world today, but that number must increase to 14 billion by 2050 to meet global need. Each of these appliances must be filled with a refrigerant. Another way to look at the trends is in the forecasted growth in energy required for air conditioning, which is expected to more than double by 2050. Thankfully, the global community has taken some action to mitigate the worst effects of this growth. In 2016, the parties to the Montreal Protocol adopted an amendment at the meeting in Kigali, Rwanda, that established a schedule for the phase down of the production of HFCs. This Kigali Amendment requires industrialized countries to reduce HFC production and consumption 85% below baseline by 2036, with rapidly industrializing and developing countries following in the subsequent decade. It's anticipated that this single policy, if complied with, will avoid a full 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. The US signed this amendment, but the Senate has not ratified it, despite a formal request from President Biden earlier this year. Nevertheless, the US EPA has begun issuing rules and regulations to bring US policy in line with Kigali. The regulation, authorized by the bipartisan American Innovation and Manufacturing Act that was enacted in December 2020, requires American manufacturers to reduce HFC production and consumption by 85% over the next 15 years, as illustrated on the slide. This is very much in line with the Kigali schedule as well. And these regulations follow a wave of HFC restrictions and even flat out bans at the state level throughout 2020 and 2021, including in Massachusetts, which prohibits the use of high global warming potential HFCs in a number of end-use applications. Interestingly, heat pumps are excluded from this regulation. According to the regulators, suitable alternatives had not been identified for HFCs and heat pumps at the time, and so they were not able to mandate a replacement. As HFCs are being phased out, alternatives are being identified and commercialized. There are generally 4 options for replacing conventional HFCs. Low global warming potential HFCs like R32, also sometimes called HFC 32, or difluoromethane, or CH2F2. This gas has a 100-year global warming potential of about 704 or 705. There's another class of organofluorine compounds called hydrofluoroolefins, or HFOs, which have a global warming potential of 1. There are blends of HFCs and HFOs, and the 4th category are so-called natural refrigerants like isobutane, which in the HVAC world is called HC600A, propane, HC290, ammonia, and even CO2 itself, which is called R744. Each of these options has different thermodynamic and safety properties, which means that there's really no single best option for all applications, as shown in this table from the IEA UNEP cooling report. Many of the natural refrigerants are flammable, which has attracted the opposition of fire safety advocates. I must say, I find this odd, considering we currently pipe pressurized natural gas into everybody's homes. I'd be interested in seeing the comparative risk assessment of using propane-based refrigerants and heat pumps in order to eliminate natural gas service. But in reality, it seems as if flammability is sometimes being used as a straw man, and certain industrial interests are using the standard setting process as a way to maintain their product's market position, climate be damned. These refrigerants are largely not drop-in replacements, which means you'd need an entirely new system based on that technology. This limits the speed with which HFC alternatives can be diffused throughout the economy, as it relies on the turnover of a very large quantity of appliances and capital equipment. The risk and reality of HFC emissions from heat pumps surely dulls the sheen of the climate-friendly technology, but by how much? There are 2 trade-offs that need to be considered. The first is a comparison between the emissions from the combustion of natural gas and fuel oil for home heating and the emissions associated with the production of the electricity needed to run the heat pump. The second adds in questions about refrigerant leakage. So we've already discussed how the COP of a heat pump can be between 2 and 4, or 200% and 400%. And while the efficiency of natural gas furnaces today is between 80 and 95%. However, if natural gas is used to produce the electricity that drives the heat pump, only about 35% of the energy in the natural gas gets converted to electricity that makes it to your home. So if you have 10 kilowatt hours of natural gas energy and you burn it in a furnace, you get between 8 and 9.5 kilowatt hours of heat. If you burn the same amount of gas energy in a power plant to produce electricity to run a heat pump with those parameters on the screen, you get between 7 and 14 kilowatt hours of heat. Depending on the specifics, even in this crude back of the envelope calculation, it's possible for a heat pump to have a higher carbon footprint than a gas furnace. Specifically, to break even with a top of the line 95% efficient gas furnace, you need an average heat pump COP of 2.7, which could be tough to achieve in Massachusetts winters. Adding HFC emissions only makes the picture look worse. One study from California estimates that a heat pump may leak more than 5 kilograms of high global warming potential HFC 410A over its lifetime, which is about 23 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Based on the average Massachusetts household consumption of natural gas, that's the climate equivalent of 6.5 years of natural gas heating, just from refrigerant leakage. More evidence of HFC leakage from heat pumps comes from a bit closer to home. Bigmeister Design Build, located in Newton, reports that a number of the heat pumps they've installed in local projects have actually begun failing and leaking HFC 410A due to a very peculiar form of corrosion affecting the copper pipes, as you can see in this photo provided by Bigmeister employees, I guess owner employees now. So you can compare the shiny uncorroded copper right next to the discolored metal in the upper line. Oddly, this corrosion seems to be due to unique environmental conditions in the Northeast. In any event, this example reinforces the need to move towards lower GWP refrigerants, as unanticipated leaks are inevitable. And I should say, Bigmeister is on top of it, and they're working with their clients and the manufacturers of the heat pumps to repair these lines, as well as install ongoing monitoring. My analysis so far doesn't look that favorable to heat pumps, but let's dig a bit deeper. First of all, the recommendation isn't just to adopt heat pumps in a vacuum. The theory of change here is that electricity is easier to decarbonize than direct fossil fuel use is. So we electrify our appliances while decarbonizing the electricity grid. The more renewable and zero carbon electricity on the grid, the better the heat pump looks compared to natural gas. Second, that California study of HFC leakage, it found that the majority of the leakage happened at the end of the heat pump's life. Whoever retires that appliance just vented the gas to the atmosphere, rather than collecting it responsibly and either reusing it or destroying it. Given that we are entering a new regulatory regime around HFCs, there are programs to ensure proper refrigerant management, as I'll get to shortly. Finally, there is a significant impact from natural gas use that is hidden in not only my calculations, but the official emissions factors, which is methane leakage from gas transmission, distribution, metering, and appliances. Recent research has confirmed the suspicions of advocates that gas leaks in Boston are at least 3 times higher than the activity-based accounts maintained by Mass DEP, which I used those overly low estimates in my own decarbonization study. So there's work to be done to recalibrate expectations around natural gas leaks. To summarize, on the margin, heat pumps might not be the clear climate winner that they're supposed to be. However, deep decarbonization is not a marginal project. It's a structural one. And heat pumps powered by renewable energy allow for the elimination of natural gas distribution, in which case, even with significant high GWP HFC loss, heat pumps beat natural gas furnaces handily. Add to this the fact that new low GWP refrigerants are being brought onto the market even now, and I'm even less concerned about the trade-offs than I was before. In the Massachusetts 2050 decarbonization study, I modeled the effects of different policy designs on total forecasted F-gas emissions in Massachusetts, illustrated here in the aggregate. You can see that without any policy intervention, annual F-gas emissions are anticipated to increase by nearly 50% by the end of the planning period, far from the goal of deep decarbonization. The policies considered are all still relevant: a refrigerants management program that prohibits intentional venting of HFCs, has licensing requirements for refrigeration technicians, leak repair, and other data management practices, use of the EPA's Significant New Alternatives Policy, or SNAP, to drive new technology adoption, And these are actually the rules that Massachusetts and a number of other states promulgated at the state level after the EPA's attempt. There was rules 20 and 21, they were blocked by the court. And you also have a California-based policy package called the Short-Lived Climate Pollutants Program, which is similar in structure, but much more aggressive than SNAP rules, and the Kigali Amendment, which I've already discussed. Between when I began my modeling exercise and today, Massachusetts has put the SNAP rules in place at the state level, and Kigali equivalent rules are in place at the federal level. This gets us much of the way there in terms of emissions reductions in F-gases, as shown in the figure on the slide. However, some of the low GWP alternatives allowed under the SNAP rules are still thousands of times stronger than CO2, and at present, heat pumps aren't even subject to those rules. Nonetheless, I feel confident ending this presentation with a strong endorsement of heat pumps as a climate-friendly solution to home heating in Massachusetts. I've shown where the program can fall short. Without decarbonizing electricity, heat pumps can be a loser both in terms of climate and, according to a recent study published in Environmental Research Letters, cost as well. Similarly, if we aren't able to contract natural gas service as we expand heat pumps, or if alternatives to HFCs don't come on the market fast enough, the promise of this technology will be unmet. Simply advocating for the adoption of heat pumps is not enough. Decreasing the GWP of refrigerants and heat pumps in particular is essential as fast as we can. Waiting for the effects of Kigali is risky. Technology-specific regulations can help to accelerate the transition to low GWP and natural refrigerants. In the meantime, elements of a refrigerant management program that worked so well to mitigate ozone-depleting substances can be adapted to HFC emissions, including leak repair and prevention and end-of-life management. But we should also keep in mind that avoiding the use of energy is environmentally preferable to using even clean energy. I know this presentation was about heat pumps, but if we expand out to consider home heating in general, efficiency must come first. Insulation, which has its own F-gas problem, weatherization, envelope sealing, window replacements, etc., can make heat pumps substantially more effective by decreasing the heating load in the first place. So I'm going to close with a more general thought. I've really enjoyed exploring and modeling aspects of heat pumps for residential heating because this issue exemplifies the messiness and complexity of environmental technology transitions. We want silver bullets for our climate challenges as well as all the other components of sustainability. It would make the arguments and the policies so much simpler, but they don't exist. Every technology that offers us a path for significant climate mitigation at scale brings its own environmental baggage that in turn must be dealt with. This isn't a message that necessarily galvanizes action or sells books, but I believe the complexity must be central to how we craft the details of climate policy. Scaling up photovoltaics deployment by 100 or 1,000-fold, we should have a plan for the tidal wave of electronics waste that comes as solar panels reach their expected 20-year end of life. Replacing every car on the road with an electric car, we need to look closely at the way we're going to source battery materials well into the future. And electrifying home heating, well, you're currently doing the responsible thing of considering the inherent climate risk of the refrigerants, and rather than seeing the risk and throwing up your hands, you're embracing the complexity and saying, well, how do we address this problem too? Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Jonathan, thank you very much. This was a very clear presentation of a very obviously very complex subject. So we have a number of questions and comments in the chat. I will quickly go through them, and some of them are already answered. So are there specific brands of heat pumps are better than others? A question from Linda Statopoulos.
It's a great question. I've got to admit, I'm not that familiar with the different manufacturers of this. I believe there might be some project developers on the call who might be able to offer an idea in the chat.
Okay, thank you. And Craig Sherman asked, at what external air temperature does the efficiency of a heat pump drops to 100%, the same as resistive heater?
It's a great question. So theoretically, never. Absolute zero. But of course, in practice, COP is affected by a lot of other things, including moisture and the effect of temperature on bearings and spinning parts and all sorts of things. I would imagine it's quite low. I can go pull up an old thermodynamics textbook and try to find the answer for you, but it's not a temperature that we'll experience.
So Mark in his next comments says maybe minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. Mark?
Well, it's a slightly different question, right? The question is, when does it get to be just as efficient as electric resistance heat? The answer is that's a really low temperature. When does it stop working really well? So you need supplemental heat. The currently available low temperature heat pumps are going to function as a heat pump down to around minus 13 Fahrenheit. Their efficiency goes down, but they keep producing heat. Below that temperature, as I understand it, you need some other form of heat to make the system work. It's not in the lab, it would continue to generate heat, but that's not going to work in your house. That's down, in my experience, from the old 35 degrees. In the past 10 years, that number has gone from, at 35 or so degrees, you put on supplemental heat, to now it's minus 5, minus 10, minus 13. So that's what we got.
And I have to say, I still have some open questions. And in preparing this talk, I read through some scientific literature to see what the effect of these natural refrigerants might be on that low end. And there's some real technical work to be done to achieve that low temperature functionality with these admittedly less effective refrigerants.
Thank you. We have a question from Karen and John Sloat. You estimated 2.7 COP required for heat pumps to break even in a typical Massachusetts winter. Where would the COP break-even number be for an entire year of 4 seasons?
Interesting. So I would prefer if you wouldn't take that 2.7 COP and run with it. That was a back of the envelope calculation, to sort of demonstrate that way of thinking. It's certainly like if I could do a more substantial modeling effort. Interestingly, I'm not even sure. We don't generally need heating and cooling in the shoulder months in New England. Little bits here and there. And COP means something a little bit different in under cooling than it does under heating. Thermodynamically it's equivalent, but there are no alternatives. So comparing a 2.7 COP in the winter to compare to, for instance, efficiency of other heating options is one thing, but cooling COP is usually, it's less than heating COP, but there's no alternatives to air conditioners for cooling a house actively. No practical ones anyway.
Okay, so we have Paul Elteringham. What is your prediction with regard to when CO2 heat pump for residential space conditioning may be readily available? Also, any thoughts on when, if we might have air-to-water heat pumps? Well, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, so to be perfectly honest, I don't know much about the second technology, so I can't comment on that, but I'd be interested if anybody else can. When I was doing the modeling work for the Massachusetts study, we spent some time considering the technology diffusion curves in Europe and Japan, where natural refrigerants are more mature. And with concerted sort of policy action, we were throwing around words like a decade, timings like a decade. I'm unwilling to go any more precise than that because I didn't do a detailed technology, like techno-economic analysis of these options. Certainly much further away than propane, isobutane, and ammonia heat pumps, which have, there are commercial products that use those refrigerants. I'd be interested, Paul, if you've seen, if you've seen anything on the market, like what is your sense?
Alina, I see your hand, but you have to wait till for Mark and for Scott Rotman. So Mark has a comment on the leak proofness.
Well, I've got two comments. One is on leaks, which is, somebody said, are some brands less leaky than the others? In my experience, which is not, I've overseen programs which are trying to deal with this. The machines work fine and do not leak. The installers don't necessarily connect them properly. This corrosion business that Jonathan talked about, if the pipes are damaged or the tubes are damaged, they will leak. The big problem is at the end of life, the system has died for some reason, and the installer comes and says, okay, and vents it, which is against, among other things, against the law. Then you get 100% leak. It's a lot, I think controlling the leaks on that level is a lot about training and oversight of the technicians who are dealing with the systems. With the CFCs, with pretty aggressive EPA controls, they went away. I mean, there was, first of all, they got out of the systems, but they stopped leaking too, because believe me, I've run an air conditioner replacement program, and the EPA watches what you do with that. You don't get to leak it very much. In terms of alternative source heat pumps, in Japan, there are several companies that are making commercial CO2 heat pumps right now, and they have small ones available to heat. The CO2 heat pump will produce water at 170 or 180 degrees Fahrenheit, which, if you're running a Japanese bath, is just perfect. And so they have that technology. It's available. It's not available in the United States, but they are being produced there in Japanese homes right now. I suspect that Jonathan is right, which is it'll take a decade to diffuse. But we're not talking about inventing a new thing, right? We're talking about adapting things which are made for commercial use in Japan for residential use in the United States.
So thanks. We have a question from Scott Rotman. Is there a difference in refrigerant use and impact on the environment between air source and ground source heat pumps, given the relative stability of ground temperatures?
To answer this, we would have to turn to an installer who knows what the market looks like. Certainly, if the thermodynamics are different, then there are different possibilities. In practice, I'm not so sure. If the commercial options take advantage of that difference. Also, there are many different types of ground source heat pumps and lots of different types of heat cycles that are available. So unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer to that. To my read of your question, there's nothing fundamental about air source versus ground source heat pump that would lead to a wildly diverging environmental risk or climate risk.
Okay, well, we see that a lot of more research is necessary. So Halina is first and then Craig. Halina, can you speak up? We don't hear you. You're muted.
It was a superb presentation. Thank you very much. What I would like to address is to be less technical than my predecessors and talk about the system and institutions involved. So, okay, traditionally, what we do is we invent a new technology, and when we find the problems with technology, we look for something else that's better, and then we move linearly again, and which is exactly what we did with refrigerants. We started out, let me remind you, with ammonia as the original refrigerants. And then CFCs were invented as superior and on, right? And what you stated, and I appreciate that you stated it, is that we need to take care of all these other pieces. When we invent new refrigerants, we have to have a plan of how to handle them at the end of their lives. And we have to have that plan in the beginning of their lives, not when we discover there is a problem. When we're pushing legislature right now in Massachusetts toward that would push for massive electrification of houses, we need to, at the same time, have a legislature that pushes for massive insulation of houses, right? You don't go with electrification without insulation at the same time. In fact, insulation should be done first, right? To reduce the size of the system and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, these pieces belong to different institutions, right? Those who worry about electrification are the techno-optimists out there that see great beauty in electrification. But those who worry about insulation are much more mundane type, and it's the building codes and this and that and so on, different people. But I think that people like you, Mark, that's my plea to you, who take the initiative in writing, proposing bills for the legislature. This is where bills have to be written in such a way that we don't continue on this linear progression. Whoops, this is great, but whoops, we didn't think of this. So maybe tomorrow we'll think about this. Because the result is we just don't make a lot of progress. We just keep spinning our wheels. And I think it's extremely important that it's put on the agenda now. And I don't see that. I do not see my piece.
Who wants to react? Who first?
I just have a quick comment. Thank you, Helena. I agree completely. I don't know, the institutional domain is a bit far from kind of my area of expertise, but I am familiar with interesting private sector actors that are trying to cut through some of the institutional sort of ossification maybe. And some of the most exciting ones are those that are focused on social aims and environmental justice. So using that as sort of the tip of some sort of spear in order to bring together all of the tools necessary to address residential primarily, but maybe residential and commercial, or civil society or religious institution energy use. So two organizations that come to mind are Groundswell, which it brings together a number of smaller scale energy users to have some purchasing power, negotiating power with not only energy suppliers, but also retrofitters and suppliers of HVAC services and other actors in that space, and Block Power, which is a for-profit. They've been making a lot of waves recently by focusing on split incentive problems, multifamily housing, really housing milieus that have really left policymakers completely flummoxed for a long time. Donald Baird and his team are figuring out interesting strategies. And so, certainly engaging legislatures is clearly essential because it's enabling. But legislatures are reactive and old. They sort of work the way that they work because of a problem that existed generations ago. And maybe there are some slightly more agile, I don't know. Hearing me say this goes against my, political ideologies, but
it's all recorded, Jonathan. Take care.
I know it's great. I'm not.
Remember that you're talking to pretty old people here.
Mark, I'm sure you have to say something about this.
I mean, we need to add the controls on these refrigerants that are being installed. It's not, people are putting in air conditioners all over the Commonwealth with or without programmatic support because it's getting hotter. And the mass installation of heat pumps / air conditioners is underway. So our policy comes in to channel it and to try to bring about the environmental safeguards that come with it. And anyway, so we need a complementary bill to bring Massachusetts control over refrigerants up to the greatest possible standard that a state can do. And I also think that the technological effort to get less dangerous refrigerants into the pipes of what would be new systems is there. But the question we have is, you can make an argument that says, well, why don't we wait for that why don't we wait for that to happen and not electrify buildings now? The work that Jonathan has done indicates that with decent controls, that's a bad choice. That would do better in terms of forestalling climate catastrophe by pushing hard on electrification and adding the controls that have to come with it. Again, it would be lovely, and I'm all for having a magic bullet that solves this problem in one stroke. And if anybody can present it, I can guarantee that we'll work for it. But failing that, it's going to be an assembly of measures, none of which are perfect, but hopefully together they produce good results. Let me just say one more thing, which is that what Jonathan said about efficiency coming first is a bedrock principle that we are organizing around. And while there are climate issues related to different insulation products, also, as always, they're a lot more manageable and there are a lot more alternatives than there are among refrigerants at the moment. So I think we can agree on that and push as hard as we can on that side of things, and then try and shape the electrification to be as climate beneficial as possible.
Okay, Mark, we keep an eye on you, your SLT, and your activities to draft this type of legislation. So the next is me, but I will skip it. Craig Sherman asked, it is my understanding that an average COP of 2.5 is required for the annual cost of heating using an electrical heat pump, and to be about the same as using a natural gas system. Sounds about right?
Yeah, more or less. You use similar sorts of back of the envelope calculations that I presented to get to that answer, but you have to do the analysis. Like, if you actually are going to develop a project, we need to do a detailed assessment of energy needs and cost of fuel versus cost of electricity, and things like that. But more or less, I've seen similar numbers.
So Paul Eldrinkamp mentioned 14A for most residential house source, ground source heat pumps, same as air source. So Alan Fears, will this presentation be available for viewing at a later date? The answer is yes. We will leave it to Kurt Newton, who's kindly acting as the host of this presentation. And then Paul Eldrinkamp again. I think, Paul, you should speak up yourself at this moment. Okay, you're making a pitch for a easy to install heat pump product that is soon on the market. Could make a difference for renters and landlords. Do you want to speak on that, Paul?
I don't feel a need to speak to that. Go to the link and encourage the developers of the product.
Okay, thank you. So Jennifer Steele, following on Halina's comments, I would like to put in a plug for the importance of developing insulation options for homes that have some but suboptimal insulation. She lives in a 1961 Cape, apparently with just enough old fiberglass bedding to foil efforts to increase insulation without undertaking a major retrofit. In other words, what about partially insulating, partially using heat pumps while holding on to gas as a backup? Jonathan?
I don't have a detailed response to sort of that scenario. The one thing that came to mind is something I didn't really mention. I maybe mentioned in passing is that blow-in insulation, which is sometimes used in projects where opening walls and putting in better batting is impractical. It has its own fluorinated gas problem because the propellants used in blown insulation tend to be high global warming potential F gases, and those need to also be are being regulated by the same many of the same tools that I have mentioned in my presentation.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, when I used to run energy efficiency programs, we had a strong preference for cellulose insulation because it was made out of recycled newspaper and borax and had almost no global warming impact, and you could blow it into a cavity and get a pretty good air seal insulation from it. There's a lot of work being done with new foams, not that new anymore, which have exactly which use fluorinated gases as propellants that have this other problem. It's a one-time off-gassing thing, but it's not insignificant. But there are, as I said, there are products in insulation which get around this. Again, our personal favorite was cellulose insulation, which can be used a lot, but you need to train people. It's not as sexy as some of the other materials that are being offered, and but it works better.
So Maria Wilkins reminds us that the Jobs with Justice bill, that's the one that Mark was talking about, is not just heat pumps, but also about valorization and efficiency. Kurt reminds us that we will all receive a link. Maybe if you're not registered, the link will also appear on the website of 350 Mass, and otherwise we can send it to you. And then Leana Rossellini, someone asked if there was an easy way to detect leaks. That was actually me. I don't think that has been answered. So please, is there an easy way to detect leaks? If not, should it be developed?
So I don't know one offhand, but I do know that, I don't know of a product that I could offer you, but detecting chemicals in the air is something that in general is something we can do. The general we, not me personally. It can be done. And detecting leaks in retrospect is also something that can be done, the ways to monitoring charge levels and things like that. And so I know from a brief correspondence with the Big Meister folks, they're actively monitoring kind of the status of those lines, and I don't know exactly how they're doing it, if they're doing it with sensors or they're doing it simply by monitoring charge levels.
Yeah, it's common practice is charge level monitoring. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know whether there's a gas analyzer, but you can certainly detect natural gas leaks and other things like that with a device, a little thing that has a wand on it and sets off alarms. And I don't know if there's one for Hfcs, but we should look. What is common practice is to weigh out the charge. There's supposed to be 5 pounds of charge in the system. You evacuate the system and weigh the charge. If it's less, you had a leak. As Jonathan said, that's retrospective. It's not easy, but it does work. Anyway, and then somebody put in the thing, you can, if it's an active leak and you put soapy water on the tubing, it will bubble and you'll see that a leak is happening. That's a lot of the way they detect natural gas leaks as well.
Yeah, Jonathan, I was really glad that you reminded us of all the natural gas leaks. And this, of course, goes in 2 ways. One is that this is an enormous greenhouse gas emission. On the other hand, it also reminds us that gas is leaking, and it's very hard to close all gas systems. So we're replacing one gas-based system for another. And yeah, but I think that your presentation was very powerful. I think that if I try to round up, that we can say we should first insulate as much as we can, which means that the electrification will come after and that installing heat pumps will hopefully be accompanied by better refrigerants from a greenhouse gas perspective, maybe more natural refrigerants, and hopefully the legislation process will go ahead of this so that we so that HFCs are mandated or are forbidden very soon, while we ramp up this refrigeration effort and in the state of Massachusetts. So I think this has been a very rich and very interesting two presentations and rich discussion. And I can allow for a last question or comment from the audience, if there's anything left. And otherwise, I would like to give the last word to Jonathan. Maybe you have a last thought to give to us after this discussion.
I think I just want to thank you all for inviting me and kind of letting me bring a mix of some technical analysis, a bit of engineering, bit of sort of a little bit of history, and some, of my own commentary about, complicated environmental technology transitions. I'm so pleased to now be a part of this, part of this community, and look forward to supporting efforts to really shift how we build and maintain and heat and power our homes in Massachusetts. Thank you all.
So thank you for all your work, also for the state of Massachusetts and the roadmap. It was a pleasure to work with you. And I want to thank you all, also Mark, of course, for this great meeting, and we will get it recorded. Thank you, Kurt, for being the host, and 350 Massachusetts for organizing it. Thank you very much. And have a nice evening. Bye-bye.